In regards to the pasuk Eile Pekudei HaMishkan, Asher Pukad al Pi Moshe Avodas HaLevim Biyadi Somor, we have a machloikus in the Mefarshim what this word Pekudei actually means and what Eile Pekudei is referring to. So one explanation is that Eile Pekudei HaMishkan is referring to the Maaseh HaMishkan, to the construction, to the making of the Mishkan that was discussed in the previous parsha, in Parshas Vayakel, where it was discussed in detail about how the Mishkan and all of the Kalim were made. According to this, the translation of the word Pekudei, when we speak about Pekudei HaMishkan, and this was Avodas HaLevim, the word Pekudei is from the word Tafkid, meaning a task. So these are the appointments or the assignments of the Levim that Moshe Rabbeinu had appointed them, and Isamar was the one that took charge. So these were the assignments that the Levim were in charge over the Mishkan and its Kalim. As discussed, in fact, later in Chumash Bamidbar, that the Levim were assigned this task of carrying the Mishkan and the Kalim. Another meaning of the words Eile Pekudei HaMishkan, the word Pekudei is not referring to the tasks or the appointments, but rather it means a calculation. These are the accounts, these are the numbers of the gold, the silver, and the copper of the donations of the Mishkan, which are going to be discussed later in this parsha. So according to that, the word Pekudei is more associated with the idea of taking an account of numbers, of a calculation, and then Avodas HaLevim Biyadi Isamar would mean that Isamar was the one that was in charge over the gold, silver, and copper, along with the help of the Levim. And here's what we find something surprising in Rashi. In one of Rashi's Perushim on the pasuk, Rashi is going to explain it one way, and in the other part of the Rashi is going to explain it seemingly in contradiction to that first way. So on the words Eile Pekudei, Rashi says, Beparsha zu, in this parsha, Nimnu kol mishkalei nidvas hamishkan, are counted all the weights of the donations of the Mishkan. In other words, the meaning of Pekudei HaMishkan is the calculations of the donations of the Mishkan. And if that's the case, when it says Eile Pekudei, it wouldn't be referring to that which was discussed in Parshas Vayakel, but rather what's going to come further in this parsha. As Rashi says, Beparsha zu, because we're speaking about the calculations which are actually going to be in this parsha. But a little bit further, on the words Avodas HaLevim, Rashi says, Pekudei HaMishkan v'Keilav, the Pekudei HaMishkan and its Kelim. However, we're going to understand this word Pekudei. Says Rashi, this is the avodah that's given over to the Levim in the Midbar to carry, and to take down, and to set up each person, each one of the Levim, according to the specific task that he was given, as discussed in Parshas Nosoi. In other words, according to this, we understand that Pekudei HaMishkan and Keilav is not referring to the calculation that's going to be coming up further regarding the donations of the Mishkan, but rather the fact that they were appointed over the Mishkan to carry it, to dismantle it, to set it back up, etc. Excuse me. Says the Rebbe, seemingly we would be able to answer it looking back at the Rashi on Eile Pekudei, at the end of that Rashi. After Rashi says that all the weights of the Nidvas HaMishkan, the donations of the Mishkan, were counted, Rashi says, V'nimnu kol keilav l'chol avodah, that also all of the vessels, all of the implements of the avodah were also counted. That means that in Pekudei HaMishkan, we're referring not only to the calculation of the donations of the Mishkan, but also counting all of the kelim of the avodah, which are going to be discussed later in this parsha, after the Torah relates about how the Bigdei Kahuna were made. When the pasuk speaks about Vayaviu es HaMishkan el Moshe, that they brought the Mishkan to Moshe, and then it speaks also about the fact that they counted all the different kelim. Says the Rebbe, according to this, we would be able to explain the connection of Pekudei HaMishkan with what it says Avodas HaLevim in the continuation of the pasuk, because this aspect of Pekudei HaMishkan, that is the fact that the kelim are being counted, all the kelim of the avodah, this is specifically connected to the avodah of the Levim, as Rashi says, losses, to carry, to take down, to put back up. as discussed in Parshas Nosei, as it says there, Uveshemois tifkedu, that with names you will count all of the kalim that they are appointed to carry. And it says, it's understood, says the Rebbe, simply as well, that part of the appointment, part of the assignment on carrying the Mishkan would also include the task to keep count of all of the kalim of the Mishkan and to make sure that they're all complete and so on and so forth. Says the Rebbe, but it's still not understood. What is forcing Rashi to say that Pekudei HaMishkan includes two different kinds of counting, and therefore it would be referring not only to the calculations of the donations of the Mishkan, but also to the counting of the kalim of the Avodah, and therefore you're going to have to say that Avodas HaLeviim means the idea of the Leviim being appointed over the kalim of the Mishkan to carry them and to take it down and to set it back up. On the contrary, says the Rebbe, seemingly this is a very, very difficult pirush, because the Torah actually interrupts between these two countings with the story of making the Big Day Kahuna. So it's very difficult to say that when it says Eile Pekudei HaMishkan, these are the Pekudei HaMishkan, it's going to be referring to something that's going to come up much later in the parsha, with an interruption in the middle. Says the Rebbe, since Rashi is seemingly translating Pekudei from the word of counting, so he should have learned, like most of the Mefarshim that we quoted earlier, that Avodas HaLeviim Biyadi Somor is not what we just started saying, that it means that they were appointed to carry it, but rather it means that they were appointed to count the donations of the Mishkan. The counting of the donations of the Mishkan, Moshe gave over to the Leviim, and Isamar would be the one in charge. Says the Rebbe, in addition to the question in those words of Rashi, of why Rashi has to add v'nimnu kol kelev l'chol avedasi, that the kelim were also counted, we also need to understand back to the beginning of Rashi, where Rashi says that in this parsha are counted all the weights of the donations of the Mishkan, the silver, the gold, and the copper. And the Rebbe asks, the general idea of this pirush, it says in Rashbam as well, but there it says it very brief. Eile Pekudei, says the Rashbam, cheshbo, in the calculation of the kesef, the zov, and the nechoshes. But Rashi elaborates much more. Number one, he says, but parsha zu, in this parsha are counted, etc. In other words, if Rashi would have just said, on the words Eile Pekudei, he would have just said minyan mishkale nidvas hamishkan. This is referring to the count, the calculation of the weights of the donations of the Mishkan. We would understand that Eile Pekudei, when it says Eile Pekudei, is not referring to that which says in the previous parsha, in Parshas Vayakhel, where clearly there was no total amounts mentioned of the donations of the Mishkan. Rather, it's referring to this parsha, Parshas Pekudei. So why does Rashi have to emphasize the parsha zu? So some Mefarshim explain that since there will be an interruption of a few psukim until Torah actually starts making the calculation, therefore the Rashi is preempting it by saying that nevertheless the word Eile Pekudei still fits, Eile Pekudei HaMishkan, these are, because it's going to come up b'parsha zu, in this parsha. However, says the Rebbe, we still need to understand. Rashi could have still said, he could have said the same idea, but slightly different. He should have first said, Eile Pekudei refers to the counting of the donations of the Mishkan, and then said, Ha'amr b'parsha, which will be mentioned later in the parsha, and the like. In other words, first mention the translation of Eile Pekudei, it's referring to the counting of the weights, and then add that it will be mentioned later. As we find Rashi himself does this in the beginning of Parshas Toldos. The pasuk says, Ve'eile Toldos Yitzchak, so these are the children of Yitzchak. And the Torah doesn't immediately say about Yitzchak's children. So Rashi says, Yaakov ve'Esav ho'amurim b'parsha. Yaakov and Esav that are going to be mentioned later in the parsha. So why in our case does Rashi start off with saying, but parsha zu, in this parsha, are going to be accounted for the weights of the Mishkan? Number two, Rashi says, Nimnu kol mishkale nidvas ha-Mishkan. All the weights of the donations of the Mishkan are counted. Why does Rashi need to emphasize this idea? Why can't Rashi just say the donations of the Mishkan? Furthermore, we actually find a difference between Targum Onkelos and Targum Yonason. In Targum Onkelos it says, these are minyone, the counting of the Mishkan. In Targum Yonason, it says, these are the countings of the weights and the amounts of the Mishkan. What do we see here? That Unklus, that generally is closer to Pshutei Shel Mikra, in other words, it's closer to Rashi's style, he only mentions the fact of counting. And yet Rashi is the one that chooses the one that, from Targum Yonason, adding the word Mishkalei, the idea of weights. On the other hand, says the Rebbe, Rashi actually omits and doesn't say what Targum Unklus says, the word Uschumoin, the total amounts. Says the Rebbe, the explanation of all of this is, Rashi, in his explanation on the word Eila Pekudei, is actually coming to deal with and to answer a very simple question. The word Eila usually shows on the beginning of a new inyan. Furthermore, Rashi himself said in the beginning of Parsha Mishpatim that every time it says Eila, it's actually canceling out what the previous things, what's said previously. In other words, it's a completely new thing. So the Rebbe says, if that's the case, it's not understood, and this is what's bothering Rashi. Even if we should say that Eila Pekudei HaMishkan is referring not only to that which was discussed in the previous Parsha, but rather to the calculation of the donations that say further in our Parsha, nevertheless, our Parsha, Eila Pekudei, is still a direct continuation and outcome of the previous Parsha. It's exactly the opposite of what we usually say Eila means. It's canceling out or saying that I'm completely starting a new thing. In other words, in Parshas Vayakol we discussed how the Yidden donated for the work of the Mishkan and how they used these donations for actually making the Mishkan. Moshe Rabbeinu is now coming and giving a calculation to the Yidden how much all these donations added up to and how they were utilized. So then the question is why the word Eila, which is clearly canceling out what's said before, and not Ve'ela. Says the Rebbe, it is this question that Rashi is coming to deal with by adding the words when he says that Pekudei HaMishkan is referring to not only to the calculation of the donations, but rather also to the count of all the kelim of the avodah, which we asked before. Why is Rashi even mentioning that? That seems to be later in the parsha. The Rebbe says it's specifically by Rashi adding that helps us understand that the parsha zu, in this parsha, as Rashi says, in this parsha what's going to be discussed, we're actually starting a new idea in connection to the Mishkan. In other words, it is actually a new concept coming up now, and that's why we say Eila, as the Rebbe will continue to explain. At first glance, says the Rebbe, it seems like when Rashi says Parsha zu nimnu kol mishkalei, in this parsha are counted all of the weights, it seems to be that Rashi is translating the word Pekudei as that the word Pekudei means counting, an account, not the expression of appointment, assignment, or making it or giving a certain task. The truth, however, is that Rashi negates this pirush to say that it means counting through what these words where Rashi says, the continuation, when he says V'nimnu kol kelav, that all of the kelim are counted. How so? If Pekudei is connected to the idea of counting, Pekudei would then mean not the act of counting. Pekudei then means the sum total of what was counted, the specific amount in the bottom line count. The Rebbe proves this in the beginning of Parsha Sicha, where it says, Ki Sicha es roish b'nei Yisrael lifkudeihem. Rashi translates, when you want to know the total amount of Yidden, how many they are. So that's what the word Pekudei means. The problem, however, is you can't translate Pekudei like that when we're speaking about the kelim that are going to be mentioned later in the Parsha. Why? Because the Torah, in fact, does not give us the total number of the kelim that come up. The pasuk only enumerates them, counts them, describes them, but doesn't actually give us a total amount. So since Rashi says that Eila Pekudei is referring to both minyanim, both of these counts, both the donation of the Mishkan as well as the counting of the kelim, with this Rashi is coming to clarify that number one, Pekudei does not actually mean counting. Pekudei means an assignment, a task, an appointment. And number two, that just like we just established, that when the kelim were counted, the point was not about the sum total of the kelim, because clearly the Torah doesn't even give that. In a similar way, all of the weights of the donations of the Mishkan, it's also not about giving the total to the Yidden of the amount of the donations that were brought in and how they were utilized. And you might say, well, that was maybe important in order to ensure that no one suspects that any of the donations were used for other things. That's not the point of the Torah. That's not the point of why these things are being counted in the Parsha. All that's happening is that the Torah is enumerating, Moshe Rabbeinu is enumerating all of the weights of the Mishkan, just like the Kalim are being enumerated. The Rebbe says this is the reason why Rashi is very particular in his words. He says what was counted was called Mishkan, all the weights of the donations of the Mishkan, which we asked before also. Why is that relevant? The weights of the donations of the Mishkan. Why doesn't Rashi just say it was counted, the total amounts of what was brought in? Because Rashi is trying to clarify even more that we're not speaking about giving a total amount of everything that was brought in, which was another question we asked. Why Rashi omits that word schumhoim, like Targum Yonason says. The Torah is just enumerating the weights of the donations of kesef, zav, and achoshes, the silver, gold, and copper. What was the point of counting it? The Rebbe says just like the counting of the kalim of the avodah. In other words, both countings are to do with the task of the one that was appointed over it. Meaning, just like the counting of the kalim was connected with the fact that the Yidden had brought the Mishkan and all of its kalim to Moshe, that he should see it, he should establish that it was all done properly, as the pasuk actually says, Vayar Moshe, Moshe saw everything that was done, V'nei asu, that they did everything as Hashem said, and that's why all the kalim are being enumerated in detail. As the order would normally be, that the person appointed over it is confirming, is establishing that all the kalim and all of the details are exactly how many we need, what we need, they're all perfect, they're all complete, etc. Says that Rebbe, the same idea is actually when the Torah is enumerating the donations of the Mishkan, the weights of the donations of the Mishkan. That Moshe being the one appointed, the Balabayis, so to speak, of the Mishkan, so he's keeping track of the weights of the donations of the Mishkan. Says the Rebbe, now we can understand, we asked before, what's Eilat, starting a new thing. We now understand this is the Chidush, this is what's happening in this Parsha, as opposed to Parshas Vayakel. In Parshas Vayakel, the whole topic was about the preparations to making the Mishkan, and also the actual making the Mishkan itself. So first you have the donations of the Mishkan, then you have Betzalel and Ahaliv, etc., making the Mishkan and its Kalim. In our Parsha, we're discussing something else. We're discussing the appointments, the assignments of the Mishkan. In other words, about specific tasks of people that are going to be in charge over the Mishkan. Where do we see in this Parsha an idea of some sort of Pekudei, which we're translating now as a minui, as an appointment over the Mishkan? This is what Rashi says. But Parsha Zu, in this Parsha, is going to be counted all the weights of the donations of the Mishkan. It's going to be counted all the kalim of the avodah. This is the task of the mamunah, of the person in charge, to keep track, to keep count, to make sure that everything, all the details, are the way they're supposed to be. And in order to make even more clear the chidush of this parsha, that we're speaking about the appointments over the Mishkan, the pasuk continues and says, after Asher Pukad, Al Pi Moshe, etc., it says, Avodas halavim biyadi somer. And Rashi explains that what is the Pekudei HaMishkan, what is the appointments of the Mishkan and the Kalim? This is the Avodah that was given over to the Leviim in the Midbar, that they're going to be carrying the Mishkan, etc. In other words, Rashi is explaining the words Pekudei HaMishkan, the appointment over the Mishkan, that the Leviim were appointed by Moshe over over the Mishkan at the time when the Mishkan was made. So after the Mishkan was set up, the Avodah is now going to be given over to the Leviim. As Rashi says, this is discussed in Parshas Nosei at length, that the Leviim are the ones in charge over all the matters of the Mishkan. Says the Rebbe, according to this explanation, we're also going to understand another few surprising things in our Parsha. In regards to the calculation of the donations of the Mishkan in our Parsha, there's a discussion, a shaklavataria, and a number of Mefarshim. Because seemingly we have a few problems. Number one, the Torah only says what they did with the silver and the copper, does not say what happened with the gold. It only says how much gold there was, but it doesn't say what was done with it. Even regarding the silver, says the Rebbe, the calculation was only that which came in that the Yidden were given when they needed to be counted, the machzis hashekel, which was used specifically for the adonim, for the sockets. But there's no calculation how much other silver came in as donations for the Mishkan, as Rashi himself says, that from all of the silver that was brought in, there was most of the klei sharos were made, most of the kelim in the Mishkan were made from that silver. So what happened to the calculation of that silver? Point number 3, says the Rebbe, besides the donations of the gold, silver, and copper, there were another 10 different things that the Yidden gave for the donations of the Mishkan, as the Pasuk enumerates, and yet we don't find in our parsha that Moshe should be giving a calculation of those donations. Furthermore, says the Rebbe, the Pasuk says clearly that when the Yidden brought donations for the Mishkan, there was v'hoiser, there was more than enough, there was extras. And yet there is no calculation over here of what happened to that extra. How much extra was there? Says the Rebbe, in regards to the last 3 questions, so the Meforshim say that Moshe was giving a calculation only of those things that had extra special chshivus, were extra important, extra precious, but not from the things that weren't so precious and so important. Similarly, the amount of silver of the Nidvas HaMishkan wasn't so great, and so too, when we speak about v'hoiser, the leftovers, wasn't, again, something so important or so much. But the Rebbe is not satisfied with this. The Rebbe says, if the idea is of why are the weights of everything being counted, is because a gabbai tzedakah, someone that's in charge of collecting tzedakah, needs to give an account of all the monies of tzedakah that come in order that no one should suspect him. So then if that's the case, it makes no difference if it's a big sum or it's not a big sum. There's a concept, the Gemara learns that, the Mishnah learns that from V'hiyisem Nikiyim Me'Hashem U'Miyisrael, that you should be innocent in the eyes of Hashem and other Yidden. You need to give a full, detailed account of everything, at least down to the last shekel. And if that's the case, we're still back with a question, how is it that Rashi doesn't answer these questions? These questions are in Pshutei Shel Mikra. So many of these things seemingly missing from the account. And as we see that a number of Mefarshim, each one trying to answer in his own way, with different answers. But the Rebbe says, based on what we said, that the point of our parsha was not about the sum totals of everything. It was more about describing what are the appointments that the Levium were made over. Says the Rebbe, there's no question at all. The countings that say in our parsha, the Torah is not trying to say that Moshe Rabbeinu gave a detailed account of every last donation of the Mishkan. We're speaking about that these are things that Moshe Rabbeinu, as the one being charged to be appointed over the Mishkan, we're saying that he carried out this job by keeping count of the donations. In order to tell us this idea, it's enough that the Torah is giving us an example of some of the things that Moshe was doing. He's counting the main donations, the kesef, the zav, and the nechoshes. And therefore, says the Rebbe, it's also not a question why there's no accounting over here, a detailed accounting of what was done with the gold. Because the purpose over here is not what was done with the donations, how they were utilized, in order again to avoid suspicion. The fact that the Torah does give us some details about how it was utilized certain donations, that's only b'derech agav, that's only by the way. The main point the Torah is trying to make is, as Rashi specifically says, Nimnu kol mishkalei nidvas ha-mishkan, that the counts of the weights are saying in this parsha Eile Pekudei, because that is the job of the Mamunah. We're trying to say, what is Pekudei? What are they tasked with? And therefore there's no need to, and therefore we could avoid mentioning all of the many, many details of what was done with the gold, not even saying it b'derech agav, because there were so many things done with the gold, as is done in regards to the other donations. The Rebbe now moves on to the Yeina Shel Torah, to the wine of Torah in this particular Rashi. The Rebbe says, as we just mentioned, Rashi specifically uses the term Nimnu kol mishkalei, the weights of the Nidvas HaMishkan are mentioned. Moshe counts the weights. It's not about the value of the gold, silver, and copper, but the weight. Says the Rebbe, what's the difference between weight and the value? When we speak about weight, we're only speaking about the very material aspect of the matter, or its quantity. When we speak about the value of something, this is already more connected with its importance, with its quality, more the spirit of it. The Rebbe says in a similar way we have an avodah sodom in a person's avodah. Of a Yid making a mishkan for Hashem. When a Yid is fulfilling mitzvahs and doing Yiddishkeit generally, so he's creating this mishkan for Hashem. But there's two aspects. There's the action itself, which we would call like the mishkal, the weight, the more physical aspect of it. And then there is the kavanah of the mitzvah, the value, the inner part, the neshama of it, its content, and so on. So one might think that when a Yid is only giving to Hashem his physical action, without the kavanah, it's like the weight. How could you then say that with this you're going to build a mishkan for Hashem? And this is what we're saying, no. Mishkalei nidvas ha-mishkan, the weights of the donations of the mishkan, is something that Moshe Rabbeinu was appointed over. Moshe Rabbeinu himself is appointed, and he's the one that's counting, he's the one that's weighing all of these things that the Yidden are giving. In that way itself, he's helping it become a part of Hashem's Mishkan. Till finally the matbeya, the coin that the Yidden give for that donation, becomes, as we know, a matbeya shalesh, a fiery coin, permeated with the fire of the neshama. And through that we build, each one in our own personalized, our individual Mishkan for Hashem. And through that, of course, we are also zoicha to, and we bring closer the binyan beis hamikdash hashlishi, b'meheira v'yameinu mamash.